Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We're in Themistocles. They, therefore, might rather be credited who report that Themistocles was an admirer of Themistocles, the Phraearchian, who was neither rhetorician nor natural philosopher, but a professor of that which was then called wisdom, consisting in a sort of political shrewdness and practical sagacity, which had begun and continued almost like a sect of philosophy from Ceylon, but those who came afterwards and mixed it with pleadings and legal artifices, and transformed the practical part of it into a mere art of speaking and an exercise of words, were generally called sophists. Themistocles resorted to Mnesiphilus when he had already embarked in politics. In the first essays of his youth, he was not regular nor happily balanced. He allowed himself to follow mere natural character, which, without the control of reason and instruction, is apt to hurry upon either side into sudden and violent courses, and very often to break away and determine upon the worst. And, as he afterwards owned himself, saying that the wildest colts make the best horses, if they only get properly trained and broken in. But those who, upon this, fasten stories of their own invention, as of his being disowned by his father, and that his mother died for grief of her son's ill fame, certainly calumniate him. And there are others who relate, on the contrary, how that to deter him from public business, and to let him see how the vulgar behave themselves towards their leaders, when they have, at last, no farther use of them, his father showed him the old galleys as they lay forsaken and cast upon the seashore. Yet it is evident that his mind was early imbued with the keenest interest in public affairs, and the most passionate ambition for distinction. Eager from the first to obtain the highest place, he unhesitatingly accepted the hatred of the most powerful and influential leaders in the city, but more especially of Aristides, the son of Lysimachus, who always opposed him, and yet all this great enmity between them arose, it appears, from a very boyish occasion, both being attached to the beautiful Stesilaus of Chaos, as Ariston the philosopher tells us, ever after which they took opposite sides, and were rivals in politics, but that the incompatibility of their lives and manners may seem to have increased the difference, for Aristides was of a mild nature, and of a nobler sort of character in the public matters, acting always with the view, not to glory or popularity, but to the best interest of the state, consistently with safety and honesty. He was often forced to oppose Themistocles, and interfere against the increase of his influence, seeing him stirring up the people to all kinds of enterprises, and introducing various innovations. For it is said that Themistocles was so transported with the thoughts of glory, and so inflamed with the passion for great actions, that though he was still young when the battle of Marathon was fought against the Persians, upon the skilful conduct of the general Miltiades being everywhere talked about, he was observed to be thoughtful and reserved. Alone by himself, he passed the nights without sleep, and avoided all his usual places of recreation. And to those who wondered at the chance and inquired the reason of it, he gave the answer, that the trophy of Miltiades would not let him sleep. And when others were of opinion that the battle of Marathon would be an end to the war, Themistocles thought that it was but the beginning for far greater conflicts, and for these to the benefit of all Greece, he kept himself in continual readiness, and his city also in proper training, foreseeing from far before what would happen. And first of all, the Athenians being accustomed to divide among themselves the revenue proceeding from the silver mines at Larium, he was the only man that durst propose to the people that this distribution should cause, and that with the money ships should be built to make war against the Aeginetans, who were the most flourishing people in all Greece, and by the number of their ships held the sovereignty of the sea. And Themistocles thus was more easily able to persuade them, avoiding all mention of danger from Darius or the Persians, who were at a great distance, and their coming very uncertain, and at that time not much to be feared, but by a seasonable employment of the emulation and anger felt by the Athenians against the Aeginetans, he induced them to preparation, so that with this money 100 ships were built, with which they afterwards fought against Xerxes, and henceforward, little by little, turning and drawing the city down towards the sea, in the belief that, whereas by land they were not a fit match for their neighbors, with their ships they might be able to repel the Persians and command Greece. Thus, as Plato says, from steady soldiers he turned them into mariners, and seamen tossed about the sea, and gave occasion for the reproach against him, that he took away from the Athenians the spear and the shield, and bound them to the bench and the oar. These measures he carried into the assembly against the opposition. As Decimbratus relates of Miltiades, and whether or no he hereby injured the purity and true balance of government may be a question for philosophers, but that the deliverance of Greece came at that time from the sea, and that these galleys restored Athens again after it was destroyed. Were others wanting, Xerxes himself would be sufficient evidence, who, though his land forces were still entire after his defeat at sea, fled away, and thought himself no longer able to encounter the Greeks, and as it seems to me, left Mardonius behind him, not out of any hopes he could have to bring them into subjection, but to hinder them from pursuing him. Themistocles is said to have been eager in the acquisition of riches, according to some, that he might be the more liberal for loving to sacrifice often, and to be splendid in his entertainment to strangers. He required a plentiful revenue, yet he is accused by others of having been parsimonious and sordid to that degree that he would sell provisions which were sent to him as a present. He desired Diphilides, who was a breeder of horses, to give him a colt, and when he refused it, threatened that in a short time he would turn his house into a wooden horse, intimating that he would stir up dispute and litigation between him and some of his relations. Now, I understand the whole obedience is better than sacrifice thing. It's better to be a good person than try to do a bunch of things to make it up later. If you're like, well, if I get money, I'll be able to make sacrifices and do all these great works, but it matters how you're getting that money, doesn't it? He went beyond all men in the passion for distinction when he was still young and unknown in the world. He entreated Themistocles of Hamaon, who had a good hand at the lute, and was much sought after by the Athenians, to come and practice at home with him, being ambitious of having people inquire after his house and frequent his company. When he came to the Olympic Games, and was so splendid in his equipage and entertainments, in his rich tents and furniture, that he strove to outdo Cimon, and displease the Greeks, who thought that such magnificence might be allowed in one who was a young man and of a great family, but was a great piece of insolence in one as yet undistinguished and without title or means for making any such display. In a dramatic contest, the play he paid for won the prize, which was then a matter that excited much emulation. He put up a tablet in record of it, with inscription, Themistocles of Phrae Orhi was at the charge of it. Phronicus made it. Erymanthus was Archon. He was well liked by the common people. He would salute every particular citizen by his own name, and always show himself a just judge in questions of business between private men. He said to Simonides, the poet of Chaos, who desired something of him when he was commander of the army, that was not reasonable. Simonides, you would be no good poet if you wrote false measure, nor should I be a good magistrate if, for favor, I made false law. And at another time, laughing at Simonides, he said that he was a man of little judgment to speak against the Corinthians, who were the inhabitants of a great city, and to have his own picture drawn so often, having so ill-looking a face. Well, that doesn't matter, and people have their own opinions of those things. Gradually growing to be great and winning the favor of the people, he at last gained the day with his faction over that of Aristes, and procured his banishment by ostracism, when the king of Persia was now advancing against Greece, and the Athenians were in the consultation who should be general, and many withdrew themselves of their own accord, being terrified with the greatness of the danger. There was one Epictetus, a popular speaker, son to Euphemides, a man of an elegant tongue, but of a faint heart, and a slave to riches, who was desirous of the command, and was looked upon to be in a fair way to carry it, by the number of votes, but Themistocles, fearing that, if the command should fall into such hands, all would be lost, bought off Epictetus and his pretensions, it is said, for a sum of money. When the king of Persia sent messengers into Greece with an interpreter to demand earth and water as an acknowledgment of subjection, Themistocles, by the consent of the people, seized upon the interpreter and put him to death for presuming to publish the barbarian orders and decrees in the Greek language. This is one of the actions he is commended for, as also for what he did to Artemius, to Zelia, who brought gold from the king of Persia to corrupt the Greeks, and was, by an order from Themistocles, degraded and disenfranchised, he and his children, and his posterity, but that which most of all redounded to his credit was that he put an end to all the civil wars of Greece, composed their differences, and persuaded them to lay aside all enmity during the war with the Persians. And in this great work Cleus the Arcadian was, it is said, of great assistance to him. Having taken upon himself the command of the Athenian forces, he immediately endeavored to persuade the citizens to leave the city and to embark upon their galleys, and meet with the Persians at a great distance from Greece. But many being against this, he led a large force together with the Lacedaemonians in Tempe, that in this pass they might maintain the safety of Thessaly, which had not as yet declared for the king. But when they returned without performing anything, and it was known that not only that the Thessalians, but all as far as Boeotia was going over to Xerxes, then the Athenians more willingly hearkened to the advice of Themistocles to fight by sea, and sent him with a fleet to guard the straits of Artemisium. When the contingents met here, the Greeks would have the Lacedaemonians to command, and Eurybiades to be their admiral. But the Athenians, who surpassed all the rest together in numbers of vessels, would not submit to come after any other, till Themistocles, perceiving the danger of the contest, yielded his own command to Eurybiades, and got the Athenians to submit, extenuating the loss by persuading them that if in this war they behaved themselves like men, he would answer for it after that the Greeks of their own will would submit to their command. And by this moderation of his, it is evident that he was the chief means of the deliverance of Greece, and gained the Athenians the glory of alike surpassing their enemies in valor and their confederates in wisdom. As soon as the Persian armada arrived at Ephyta, Eurybiades was astonished to see such a vast number of vessels before him, and, being informed that 200 more were sailing around behind the island of Sciathus, he immediately determined to retire farther into Greece, and to sail back into some part of Peloponnesus, where their land army and their fleet might join, for he looked upon the Persian forces to be altogether unsailable by sea. But the Euboeans, fearing that the Greeks would forsake them and leave them to the mercy of the enemy, sent Pelagon to confer privately with Themistocles, taking with him a good sum of money, which, as Herodotus reports, he accepted and gave to Eurybiades. In this affair, none of his own countrymen opposed him so much as Architellus, captain of the sacred galley, who, having no money to supply his seamen, was eager to go home. But Themistocles so incensed the Athenians against them that they set upon him and left him not so much as his supper, at which Architellus was much surprised, and took it very ill. But Themistocles immediately sent him in a chest a service of provisions, and at the bottom of it a talent of silver, desiring him to sup tonight, and tomorrow provide for his seamen. If not, he would report it among the Athenians that he had received money from the enemy. So Phanius, the lesbian, tells the story. And, of course, lesbian as in, someone from the place, Lesbos. The other thing. Though the fights between the Greeks and the Persians in the straits of Euboea were not so important as to make any final decision of the war, Yet the experience which the Greeks obtained in them was of great advantage, for thus, by actual trial and in real danger, they found out that neither number of ships, nor riches and ornaments, nor boasting shouts, nor barbarous songs of victory, were any way terrible to men that knew how to fight, and were resolved to come hand to hand with their enemies. These things they were to despise, and to come up close and grapple with their foes. This Pindar appears to have seen, and says justly enough of the fight at Artemisium, that there the sons of Athens set the stone that freedom stands on yet. For the first step towards victory, undoubtedly, is to gain courage. Artemisium is in Euboea, beyond the city of Histiaea, a sea beach open to the north. Most nearly opposed to it stands Alezon, in the country which formerly was under Philoetes. There is a small temple there, dedicated to Diana, surnamed of the Dawn, and trees about it, around which again stand pillars of white marble, and if you rub them with your hand, they send forth both the smell and color of saffron. One of these pillars has these verses engraved on it, with the numerous tribes from Asia's region brought. The sons of Athens on these waters fought, erecting after they had quelled the mead to Artemis this record of the deed. There is a place still to be seen upon this shore, where in the middle of a great heap of sand they take out from the bottom a dark powder like ashes, or something that has passed the fire, and here it is supposed that the shipwrecks and bodies of the dead were burnt. Now, there's a lot of the anointing, messiahing of the pillars. So they could have anointed the pillars, much like in the Bible. Certain pillars were rendered messiahs, or objects thereof. Could have been sapphire, for all we know.